Today, I'll tell you about the only terrible totalitarian sect that has brought suffering to a huge number of people. A follower of the Nazi teachers, the main ideologist of this destructive organization that has spread its network across the globe, uses his adherents so as to influence consciousness of the masses and specific individuals by means of special psychotechniques, manipulate them, ruin families, break destinies, and under the guise of religion, infiltrate government bodies in order to achieve total power. Adherents of this destructive cult, many of whom have been repeatedly involved in court proceedings, have medical certificates indicating impaired mental health, and express a pathological interest in violence and manic tendencies, infiltrate state agencies, recruit more and more new members to their sect from among politicians, representatives of law enforcement and judicial bodies. Wherever the leader of this cult and his closest supporters set foot, they are followed like a shadow by hatred, discord, violence, and suppression of freedom. However, the scariest thing is that the tentacles of this cult are reaching for our children. By infiltrating educational institutions, delivering lectures there and contributing to the spread of their destructive Nazi ideology, they have a hidden effect on the psyche of school children and students. This doesn't just result in distortion of worldview and values of the younger generation, but is a threat to security of the entire society. Who is the author and leader of the only existent totalitarian cult and the sower of many human tragedies? In which countries does this sect operate? And are there people who manage to recognize the true face of this organization and escape from its influence? Today, I will answer these questions.
Every totalitarian sect seeks power over the world and power over everyone. That's why it's a sect.
In my previous videos, I already spoke about Alexander Dworkin, the inhuman yet brilliant leader of the totalitarian sect that he has been building around the world for more than 30 years. You can discover more details in this video. Outwardly, Alexander Dworkin devoted his whole life to hunting down those who, in his opinion, allegedly threaten society with their views, beliefs, business, and ideas. Having proclaimed himself a fighter against sects and cults, he built his reputation for decades on the image of a defender, but behind the facade of his supposedly noble mission lies a dark irony. While society watched him point the finger at others as criminals and a threat, it didn't notice that his own actions actually had always been a repressive machine, grinding the lives of innocent people. Society hasn't noticed that he himself is the leader of a harsh totalitarian sect. According to Alexander Dworkin, a sectarian organization resembles a very rigid totalitarian political party or an organized mafia entity. Today, I'll tell you about the characteristics which Dworkin himself came up with and which indicate that his network is a totalitarian sect, while he himself is its leader. Imagine a pyramid where every next level operates to increase influence. The first is the center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons that Dworkin personally heads. It's his ideological base generously supported by the Russian Orthodox Church and even the government. For example, in 2011 and 2012, the center received grants totaling 5 million rubles for the project titled Helping People Affected by Totalitarian Sects. It is noteworthy that the Center for Religious Studies not only does not cover the process and results of helping victims of sex and cults, but doesn't even mention this area of its organization's activities either in articles or in news on its website, or in press releases, or in the description of the center's activities on the website page about the center, or any other information resources. Although there are mentions in the media of how Dworkin works on commission, let's take, for instance, the story of Alina Brezem, whom her husband accused of sectarianism because of her partnership with Herbalife. The husband wanted to take their children away from his wife through the court and involved Dworkin's organized criminal group. To find out how people she had never seen before could act as witnesses in court, Alina called Ratseers and told them a fictional story about her husband, who allegedly fell under the influence of the Amway organization, which Dworkin also included in the list of cults and sects. In response, Ratseers representatives described an approximate scenario to her. You can hire us. We will come, tell you what to do, fabricate documents, and testify in court as witnesses, all for a certain fee. This very kind of behavior Dworkin would call financial exploitation of adherents. Yet, in the case of grants, money comes not only from zombified followers of cults, but obviously from government entities already recruited by the ideology of his sect. Next, in the hierarchical structure of Dworkin's totalitarian sect, is Ratseers. Established in 2006 as an umbrella organization to coordinate anti-cult centers in Russia and abroad. Dworkin is its president, while his faithful followers, Archpriest Alexander Novopashin, is the vice president. It turns out that Dworkin gathered around himself authoritative representatives of the church, and in order to answer the question, what for, we can refer to another characteristic of sects, which is described in his book. Totalitarian sects have nothing to do with Christianity, and the use of Christian symbols and terminology by some of them, up to calling themselves a church, isn't just blasphemous for us. We regard it as another deliberate attempt to create an image of their organization more acceptable to public opinion and mislead people who sincerely seek Christ. Indeed, Dworkin's activities and those of his right-hand man, Archpriest Novopashin, cannot be called a preaching of Christian values. Novopashin is active in media and public activities, regularly lectures for the Ministry of Interior, and in his interviews, he calls Ukrainians cannibals and propagates their destruction. He also insists that a civilizational war cannot be avoided, and calls himself a convinced monarchist, noting the following: "This topic is sacred for me, because monarchy is the only legitimate form of government according to the Holy Scripture. I've been a convinced monarchist since my youth." The final component in the structure of Dworkin's cult is FECRIS, the European Anti-Cult Federation, where Dworkin was vice president from 2009 to 2021, after which he remained on its board of directors, while Novopashin was its corresponding member since 2023. Incidentally, FECRIS is 90% funded by the French government and holds status with the Council of Europe and the United Nations, which gives its significant influence in Europe. Through this platform, Dworkin promotes the interests of the totalitarian regime, which he establishes in Russia, lobbying for anti-cult laws and spreading anti-democratic rhetoric. Meanwhile, this is already penetration into politics and manipulation of public opinion. Two more items from the list of characteristics of cults and sects that Dworkin himself compiled.
Sects are certainly a destabilizing factor because the greater the division, the greater the irritation and misunderstanding. Hence, all of this destabilizes the country, and they can be used as agents of influence.
Despite the anti-Ukrainian, anti-democratic, and anti-European rhetoric of Alexander Dworkin and his loyal follower, Alexander Novopashin, which they openly broadcast through official websites, scientific papers, and books, both actively participated in the work of Fekris. Through this platform, they didn't just attend Fekris conferences, but also organized events in Russia where they promoted anti-European rhetoric propagated by Dworkin. This is the pinnacle of cynicism. France finances those who carry out propaganda and speak out against European values, undermining democracy in Europe. There's a reason why I earlier said that Fekris, represented in many European countries, has actually become a tool for lobbying the interests of Dworkin sect both in Russia and abroad. For example, in 2017, Italian anti-cultist Luigi Corvaglia, member of Fekris's Administrative Council and Scientific Committee, visited Russia to participate in an anti-cult forum. He gave interviews to Russian mass media, supporting Dworkin's rhetoric. German anti-cultist Thomas Gandau, who also shares Dworkin views, attended the same event. International human rights activists and scholars have repeatedly pointed out that Fekris is being used to promote the separationist ideology of Dworkin and his related entities, which highlights Fekris's role as part of the anti-cult network operating in the interests of Dworkin's sect. Thus, under Dworkin's influence, Fekris manifests signs of ideological manipulation and coordination of actions against dissent, which Dworkin himself considers to be characteristics of totalitarian sects. The network operates as a well-maintained mechanism. Conferences, exchange of experiences, joint projects with organizations such as the French Miviludes, and support for regression against religious minorities. All of this is carried out under the guise of protecting society. But if you analyze their activities, Ratsiers and Fekris themselves show signs of a totalitarian sect according to Dworkin's description: strict hierarchy, information control, suppression of dissent, and desire for power. Thus, according to Dworkin, totalitarian sects strive for power over the world and over everyone, have a rigid totalitarian structure, use religion as a cover for their own selfish goals, destabilize and divide society. All these features clearly describe the actions of Dworkin himself and his followers, as well as the activities of his subordinate entities. The center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, Ratsiers, and Fekris. Therefore, even by these features, we can clearly see that Dworkin's network is a totalitarian sect. However, this is just the beginning. Separately, I'd like to note that typical adherents of Dworkin's anti-cult sect are people with manic tendencies, prone to violence and aggression, pathological liars, people with mental disorders, often with criminal records, drug addicts, and Dworkin himself is an example of that. According to an article in the Tribuna newspaper, A number of acquaintances of Alexander Dworkin's formerly close circle testify that the sectologist had serious issues with drug use. It's not surprising that Jakob Yahl, one of the active followers of the anti-cult Nazi ideology of Dworkin's sect, not only doesn't hide his love for marijuana, but also actively advocates its legalization in the Czech Republic. There are also sources indicating that he is involved in a scandal involving fraud and sexual assault, and he broadcasts anti-Semitic views. This is a typical representative of Dworkin's anti-cult sect. Dworkin has gathered around himself only those who are ready to do anything for the sake of the ideology of the sect and the authority of its leader. Can a sane, normal person in their right mind turn a blind eye to honor, conscience, and dignity, and fully devote themselves to causing suffering to others? This sect, hiding behind the fight against cults, gives them an opportunity to implement their anti-human mindsets in order to experience a sense of superiority and feel themselves as gods. There is an opinion on the web that Dworkin's obsession with harassment and persecution of various groups and individuals began with forced deprogramming in America when he started collaborating with the Cult Awareness Network, an organization that promoted a form of forced intervention by self-proclaimed deprogrammers, who forcibly detained or even abducted cult members for a substantial fee. Alexander Dworkin himself claims that he started engaging in anti-cult activities only after he had returned to Russia and was allegedly entrusted with the fight against sex as a work of penance.
What I do is not on my own initiative, but simply work of church penance. Everyone in the church does his own work, and I have a job too, though let's say, a job of a sanitation worker. But someone has to do it.
However, it's a well-known fact that Dworkin immigrated to the United States in 1978 and stayed there until 1992. During this period, he worked for the Voice of America news agency, which enabled him to be at the center of information flows and establish contacts with various public and political entities. Is it a coincidence that in the U.S., those years were the heyday of such a terrifying phenomenon as deprogramming? This phenomenon is a forced attempt to convince a person to abandon their beliefs associated with a certain group that is considered harmful. Usually, the initiators are parents or other family members who, being manipulated by anti-cultists, hire deprogrammers. People who use various methods, including isolation, psychological pressure, and even physical violence, to supposedly save a person from the influence of a given group. This includes numerous complaints and lawsuits against deprogrammers who committed rape during their deprogramming. In the United States, such violent practices repeatedly faced lawsuits and criminal charges because they violate basic civil rights, including religious freedom, guaranteed by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. For instance, Ted Patrick, who is called the father of deprogramming, was convicted of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment after performing thousands of deprogrammings in the 1970s and 80s, often with violence, for which he sometimes charged tens of thousands of dollars. Ted Patrick was the founder of CAN, an organization that positioned itself as a guardian against brainwashing, claiming that new religious movements, NRMs, like the Church of Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses, were allegedly destroying people's lives. But in the end, Can, just like its founder, became synonymous with forced deprogramming. One of the most egregious cases related to this organization was when an 18-year-old member of the Pentecostal Church was abducted on commission through the mediation of Can. The executor was Rick Allen Ross, a self-proclaimed cult expert who had a criminal record for theft in a jewelry store and a medical record of unstable mental health. He and his team held Scott for 5 days, using physical violence and psychological pressure to break his faith. The court ordered Ross to pay $875,000 US in compensation, while Can was charged with $1 million, which was a fatal blow to the organization. Here I'd like to cite a description of totalitarian sects from Alexander Dworkin's book. A person caught in a totalitarian sect is constantly subjected to violence, from beatings and rapes to exhausting, debilitating work for 15 to 18 hours daily, without the necessary nutrition and sufficient sleep. In other words, cult members become slaves, deprived of the financial, personal, and social resources necessary to leave the group, which, in turn, does everything to cling to them as long as they can still be useful. Doesn't this description of a totalitarian sect remind you of what deprogrammers did to innocent people whom they called cultists, receiving huge sums of money for bullying them? While anti-cult adherents spread false and fabricated information about religious and non-religious organizations, claiming they are dangerous or have an extremist nature, often citing scandals in the media that they themselves have falsified and exaggerated, they themselves are, in fact, a direct threat both to society and to individuals. For adherents of this sect, there are no laws or norms of morality. They use any methods to achieve their goals and spread their Nazi ideology of superiority as widely as possible. Stephen Hassan is another American expert on cults. He also visited Russia at one time and is well acquainted with the Russian pseudo-expert Evgeny Volkov, who translated most of Hassan's works into Russian. Dworkin's brochure, 10 Questions for an Obsessive Stranger, isn't really Dworkin's, but simply a translation of one of the chapters from Stephen Hassan's book titled Combating Cult Mind Control. Hassan himself is known for repeatedly engaging in criminal deprogramming, as well as supporting individuals who engaged in this activity. In one of his books, he talks in detail about how to perform deprogramming and gives examples of its application. Another fact shows the common manic traits of the adherents of Dworkin's anti-cult sect. Stephen Hassan states on his website that it's extremely important to protect yourself, your loved ones, and people around the world from the harmful effects of undue influence. However, he also states, I recommend subscribing to the Free Religion News report compiled by Anton Haynes' Apologetics Index. Anton Haynes, the founder of the Apologetics Index based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, who is known in circles related to the study of religious movements, cults, and apologetics, pleaded guilty of sexual offense in the United States. That included indecent behavior with his niece, a 13-year-old child. He served a prison sentence in California before being released on extended supervised probation. Heen violated his probation by leaving the US. He now lives in Amsterdam. An arrest warrant has been issued, which is currently in effect for the immediate arrest of Anton Heen. That's one more rapist from Dworkin's sect. As for Dworkin himself, being the cult leader, he carefully whitewashed his biography so that not a single spot is left to indicate his dark past. Instead, he created an image of a pious spiritual search and discovery of his vocation: baptism with the Orthodox Christian Church, conversion of a deluded cultist to the true faith, and protection of society from their supposedly harmful influence. Therefore, it's not surprising that it is very difficult to find information about what Alexander Dworkin was actually doing in the US at the height of the deprogramming plague, when newspapers were full of headlines about rapes, beatings, and forced abductions of innocent citizens by a criminal group of anti-cult activists. There is information on the web that in 1996, after Dworkin had returned from the United States to Russia and established the ideological center of his sect, he spoke on the Vremechko TV program. During the broadcast, Dworkin confirmed that he was an American citizen, held an American passport, and had been collaborating with the Cult Awareness Network. Now, this fragment of the Vremechko program remains only in a text in forum archives, while the video itself has been removed. Someone is meticulously covering the trails in order to clean up one of the threads in the anti-cult web woven by Dworkin, which indicates his involvement in violent deprogramming. After all, right at the time when active lawsuits against deprogrammers began, Dworkin promptly fled to Russia. One of Dworkin's patrolling adherents, a guardian of the impeccability of his guru's biography, has been noticed in altercations with the administrators of Alexander Dworkin's Wikipedia page. Yevgeny Mukhtarov, Dworkin's official representative and biographer, head of the press service of the Center for Religious Studies in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, who, together with Alexander Dworkin, was a member of the Expert Council for State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation, worked very hard to ensure that the fact of Alexander Dworkin's connection with Khan was erased from Wikipedia. And he persisted in his debates until the Wikipedia administrators agreed. Mukhtarov insisted on editing many other well-known theses about Alexander Dworkin. For example, that Dworkin is not associated with anti-cult activities and, in general, the term anti-cultism does not correlate with the anti-sectarian activities of his leader. However, at the moment, Yevgeny Mukhtarov's profile on Wikipedia says that this user is blocked indefinitely. And the blocking log contains a list of all violations and warnings against him. Some of Mukhtarov's most frequent violations of the Wikipedia rules were threats or harassment of participants, insults, and extremely unethical behavior. A typical characteristic of behavior for adherents of Dworkin's sect. Moreover, based on the messages in his debate with administrators of the website, Mukhtarov manipulated the authorities to organize persecution of one of the participants in the debate. Only people who, by Dworkin's own characterization, clearly have brainwashed minds, could so fiercely and fanatically defend their leader, ensuring that every word spoken about them aligns with the artificial ideal image created for them. While most people believe that the center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons is an Orthodox Christian organization and individuals who belong to it are nearly saints, I suggest that you look at several quotes by the press secretary of the great guru Alexander Dworkin.
Some rotter who took the nickname Outsider suggested that forum.anastasia.ru members should form a kind of virtual troupe. P.S. I wish I could find and smash him properly. Remember for the future, if I say something, I can support it with documents. So don't get too bold, otherwise your cheeks will turn blue and swell up in the end. My problem won't fit in your mouth.
I apologize for such examples, but he's a man who writes publicly. It would be appropriate to cite here another statement from Alexander Dworkin's book about characteristics of a totalitarian sect. As long as humanity has existed, there have been sects consisting of groups of fanatics following a certain charismatic leader. When fully oriented towards their leader, subordinate members of a totalitarian sect imitate him in everything. Moreover, if the head of the sect has criminal or perverse tendencies or suffers from mental disorders, the mechanism of psychological induction is triggered, a sort of infection of sectarians with the vices and mental pathologies of the sect founder. Thus, it's not surprising that Dworkin's adherents have perverse tendencies to inflict suffering on innocent people, manifest aggressive behavior, incite one part of society against another, and show interest in violence and murder, as evidenced by the news feed on the websites of the ideological centers of their sect. They carefully select the news with the most terrifying and frightening headlines, duplicate the news from their other news portals, but deliberately place their accents in order to make certain organizations more dangerous, intimidating, and sinister in the eyes of the readers. What else can you expect from adherents who worship their guru diagnosed with cyclothymia or circular psychosis, pathological personality development, psychophysical infantilism, suspected schizophrenia, disruption of a number of mental processes, and obvious signs of impaired thinking? Here is the expert conclusion of an independent psychiatric assessment of Alexander Dworkin's medical records. The patient needs constant observation by a psychiatrist. Visits to a psychoneurological clinic at least once every 2 months and, if necessary, hospitalization in a psychiatric hospital and continuous intake of psychotropic drugs. His activity is unlikely to rely on a serious scientific base maintained through long-term observation or require analytical abilities. Those will rather be superficial judgments, clothed in a bright cover, and supported by an emotional coloring that is inappropriate in its strength and modality. Neither can the examined individual be efficient in any kind of in-depth scientific activity, although we shouldn't forget about the tendency of patients with such diseases to invent and to reform, which an unprepared audience may regard as scientifically justified concepts. It can be said that psychiatric diagnoses, theft, criminal records, and drugs are the hallmark of adherents of Dworkin's totalitarian cult. Another fact confirming this is that Rick Alan Ross, the American anti-cultist and violent deprogrammer whom I mentioned earlier in the story of the trials and bankruptcy of the Cult Awareness Network, also has a psychiatric diagnosis. The involvement of this man with a confirmed mental disorder had a direct impact on the events in Waco in 1993, as he, being an anti-cultist and deprogrammer, played a key role in escalating the conflict through manipulation of mass media and law enforcement, which resulted in the tragedy that claimed the lives of 82 people, including 23 children, with 2 babies burnt in the fire. This event became a turning point that triggered a wave of violence in the United States, including the 1995 Oklahoma City terrorist attack and an increase in school shootings such as Columbine, originally scheduled for the anniversary of Waco. Facts indicate that Rick Alan Ross is the bearer of the ideology of Dworkin's totalitarian anti-cult sect. They are connected not only by mental disorders, common rhetoric, and the methods by which they systematically destroy democratic foundations of society, but also by the fact that they crossed paths at a conference in Thailand in 2011. Moreover, the activities of both Dworkin and Ross fall under another characteristic of belonging to a single totalitarian sect. Leaders of totalitarian sects disguise their goals under religious, political, psychotherapeutic, recreational, educational, scientific, cognitive, cultural, and other masks. As the goals of the anti-cult center he established, Dworkin declares research and provision of information about activities of totalitarian sects and destructive cults.
Unlike sects and cults, we advocate for the freedom of human choice in all spheres, including the religious one. But true freedom of choice is impossible without freedom of information.
Rick Alan Ross, who established the Cult Education Institute, obviously in the image and likeness of his guru center, declares similar goals.
The Cult Education Institute, CEI, is a non-profit, tax-exempt organization dedicated to public education and research. CEI's mission is to study destructive cults, controversial groups and movements, and to provide a broad range of information and services easily accessible to the public for assistance and educational purposes online through the web.
However, both the website of the center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons and Rick Alan Ross's website, CEI, do not provide research or educational materials. Both websites contain wide lists of allegedly destructive cults and sects, supported by news posts with terrible crimes committed by those whom they call cultists and sectarians. If you dive deeper into the structure of anti-cult centers like those being part of Ratziers, including the Center of Religious Studies in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, a disturbing trace emerges. Their organizational model and approaches aren't just a phenomenon that accidentally arose from the ideas of one genius with mental disorder diagnosis, but actually a carbon copy of a gloomy pattern laid down back in 1921 in Germany. Back then, the Protestant pastor and ardent anti-Semite Walter Kunith established the Apologetic Center, a Nazi propaganda machine aimed at suppressing free thought and any, quote-unquote, improper movements. Its task was to collect compromising materials, hone methods of combating dissent, and stigmatize anyone who didn't fit into the Protestant standard. Later on, these developments became a key tool for the Gestapo and the leader of the Third Reich, turning into propaganda tools against Jews and fuel for genocide. And that's not a coincidence. It's a disturbing indication of where the roots of the ideology of Dworkin's totalitarian sect originate from, especially when you consider the fact that Dworkin repeatedly mentioned with adoration his teachers Johannes Agard, under whom he studied at the Dialogue Center and after meeting with whom he founded his modern apologetic center in Russia. Johannes Agard's accomplice in establishing the Dialogue Center was the Bavarian pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack, who, in turn, became the successor to the legacy of the Nazi ideologue Walter Kuhneth. It was Johannes Agard's Dialogue Center that Dworkin absorbed inhumane methods rooted in Nazi Germany. Tools for dehumanizing and harassing those who are deemed undesirable. Those practices included meticulous information gathering, compilation of blacklists, use of poisonous rhetoric and mass media to incite public hatred, and pressure on government authorities to unleash repression against selected victims. This chain of knowledge transfer has never been interrupted. From Walter Kuhneth's Nazi Apologetic Center, through Hack and Agard, it reached Dworkin. Along this sinister line, Kuhneth, Hack, Agard, Dworkin, the methods of suppressing the freedoms and rights of citizens, honed by the Nazis, were delivered into Dworkin's hands. Today, they serve the global ambitions of the sect he established,
fuel the interests of the totalitarian regime he has built, and spread intolerance across the globe.
Members of Dworkin's sect are infected with Nazism and resurgence of the totalitarian regime. What has this led to?
Sects are always an organization. I certainly mean not just a sect, but a totalitarian sect, a destructive sect. It's always an organization that exists as a state within a state and lives by its own laws and its own rules. If those laws and rules contradict the laws of the state, then so much the worse for the laws of the state. If those laws and rules contradict the norms of ethics and morality, then so much the worse for ethics and morality.
Dworkin didn't just create a totalitarian sect, but established a system operating outside the framework of law and morality. Ratsirs, all its branches, and Fekris, which includes Ratsirs, and where Dworkin was also vice president, act as a parallel authority within countries, ignoring the laws on freedom of conscience. Dworkin's ideas, just like those of Kuhneth in the past, gained support in certain Russian government circles that sought to strengthen control over society. In 1997, the law on freedom of conscience and religious associations was adopted, restricting the activities of new religious movements and RMs. In 2002, the law on countering extremist activities emerged, which made it possible to persecute religious organizations and greatly expanded the power and influence of both Dworkin himself and his anti-cult followers. In 2009, Dworkin was appointed head of the government's Expert Council for State Religious Evaluation. Thus, the rhetoric of the anti-cult movement and the Russian state converged. Just like the Apologetic Center during the Nazi era, the center in the name of Irenaeus of Lyons, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, which Dworkin has also been dragging into his totalitarian sect throughout the time, has become a key guideline for Russian authorities in determining which religious associations should be considered sects and potential threat to the national ideology. Fekris, where Dworkin was vice president, as well as representatives of other organizations related to him, actively intervene in politics. For example, Ursula Kaberta, whose document is posted on Fekris' website, introduced a sect filter in Hamburg due to which Scientologists have been deprived of jobs and loans. Whereas Elaine Vivian in France secured laws allowing the abolition of any organization under the pretext of mind manipulation. Dworkin's dreams of introducing the same methods in Russia, stating, "It is necessary to introduce law provisions on psychological violence and manipulation of consciousness, like in France." Now, I suggest that we refer to the following characteristics of a totalitarian sect that Dworkin highlights: presence of a charismatic leader, concealment of its true goals, the principle of a state within a state, and lobbying for anti-democratic laws. In other words, Dworkin and his network again fall under his own criteria of a totalitarian sect. What can I say? As they say in a very old joke, the main thing during an investigation is not to end up uncovering yourself. Dworkin spent so much effort and time trying to figure out what characteristics totalitarian sects have that he unknowingly described his own activities in detail. To be serious, the outcome of the activities of Dworkin's sect is ruined destinies of a huge number of people. In his interviews, books, and lectures, he relentlessly fabricated an enemy image out of innocent citizens. Consequently, this rhetoric spread not only in Russia, but has also been disseminated by his adherents all over the world. The destructive ideology of Dworkin's sect has already become fuel for repression in Russia. Religious minorities, human rights, commercial, nonprofit, and public organizations are declared extremists. Their members are imprisoned, tortured, and persecuted. Fear and hatred are entering society like poison. This is not just a fight against cults and sects. It's a war against democratic human rights and freedoms. By constantly whipping up an atmosphere of fear against innocent citizens, members of organizations such as Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of Scientology, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the Unification Church, the New Life Evangelical Christian Church, Pentecostal churches, as well as numerous educational organizations, self-development courses, and even marketing companies. Dworkin's adherents caused many of the members of those organizations to suffer violence, attacks, harassment, litigation, and restriction of freedom. It was exactly Dworkin's sect that influenced the government and caused the peace-loving organization Jehovah's Witnesses, whose members preached the principles of nonviolence, compassion, and love for one's neighbor, to be recognized as extremists. Continuous litigations, criminal prosecution, and violence are all present-day reality for the members of this organization. To date, 12 Jehovah's Witnesses have died in custody, and more than 700 followers of the church have been criminally prosecuted. This is the true face of Dworkin's sect and its adherents. While they make beautiful speeches on broadcasts, come to secondary schools and universities with lectures, consult law enforcement agencies and judicial authorities, at the same time, a huge number of innocent people suffer and die behind bars at their hands. Yet, why do they find it vital to embed themselves in areas that involve children, young people, and education?
But there is another brain drain, internal and therefore even more dangerous. Cultists are hunting for talented, energetic, intelligent young men and women, for the flower of the nation, for the future of our country. So many of them have already left science, industry, family, and the sphere of normal human relations forever in order to give themselves entirely to one or another guru or messiah.
Dworkin sectarians use any methods to infiltrate various educational institutions in order to manipulate the minds of the younger generation, to impose on them that sectarians and cultists are scary and dangerous. They deliberately apply the method of guilt by association when talking about ordinary law-abiding citizens of a particular religion and give negative examples of cases of murder and violence in order to consolidate a negative association with a given organization at the subconscious level. After all, when a person is scared, it's easy to convince him that adherents of a cult or a sect represent the lowest caste, while the person himself is in the highest. In this very way, under the influence of Walter Kunith's methodology that is currently used by Dworkin's anti-cult accomplices, the intelligent and educated Germans became Nazis. This is exactly how anti-cultists manipulate people's minds. And a person doesn't even notice that by adopting the ideology of Dworkin's sect, he unwittingly puts himself above others. And this already begets Nazism inside. What will be the next step? This way, anti-cultists are building a future for themselves. They expect that the next generation, whose consciousness they have programmed at secondary schools and universities, will be the ones who come to power in government bodies. Those will be anti-cult adherents in power. Germany of the 1930s. That's what they want, in fact. How do lectures in schools delivered by adherents of Dworkin's sect usually end? If the parents of children are in some religion, such as Jehovah's Witnesses or another one, they are declared cultists. Children face ridicule, bullying, and harassment. That's what Dworkin's sect actually does. They sow discord and hatred. These are people prone to violence. People with perverted manic tendencies because only maniacs can enjoy what they do, knowing that their actions cause immense suffering to innocent people. If we face the truth, Dworkin's totalitarian sect is a sequester that has separated itself from the entire healthy humankind and is sick with superiority. That is, with Nazism. While Dworkin dehumanizes innocent people and compares them to a cancerous tumor, he himself is destroying the entire healthy society with his metastasis. Let's summarize a little. The presence of a charismatic leader who is echoed and unconditionally obeyed, the presence of an organization with a rigid hierarchy, psychological and physical violence, the constant desire to expand their power and recruit new adherents, the mimicking of a popular religion to conceal their real goals, the division of society into a higher and lower castes, the desire to infiltrate and pressure the authorities. All this, according to Dworkin, are signs of a totalitarian sect. Yet at the same time, they perfectly describe Dworkin's own activities and the operations of his network. Thus, Dworkin's network is a totalitarian destructive sect, and Alexander Dworkin himself is its rigid sole leader. How did one person with a documented mental disorder manage to achieve such power? A huge network of adherents all over the world unquestionably spreads the ideological rhetoric of Dworkin's totalitarian sect.
That's what the sect is trying to achieve: information control. As we have already said, these are the four main points: behavior control, emotion control, language control, and information control. Using these methods, the sect achieves complete control over a person's life, personality, and consciousness. As a result, an ordinary free man turns into an enslaved sect follower.
Information control is a key tool of Dworkin's sect. Thanks to the recruited adherents in the media both in Russia and around the world, It is only necessary for him to snap his fingers, and the instruction of this guru, with the right phrases and special anti-cult rhetoric affecting people's subconscious, are distributed throughout this network in a coordinated manner. Thus, Dvorkin exerts an influence on public opinion not only in the religious and ideological sphere, but also, to a significant extent, in the political realm.
Each sect has its own language it uses. This is almost always the case. When studying sectology, you quickly learn to recognize such a person. It's easy to recognize sectarian publications. They are all written in a certain language, a certain style. These texts are very similar. A sect has its own special vocabulary, so to speak, which forms a whole layer of vocabulary.
Another common characteristic of Dvorkin's adherents is that their destructive activities are often aimed not only at oppressing undesirable groups, but also at dehumanizing representatives of the political sphere. In addition to the obvious Russian adherents of Dvorkin, who are negative towards Western politicians, a number of anti-cult adherents, such as Stephen Hassan, Rick Allen Ross, Luigi Carvalho, Dave Troy, Jakob Yall, as well as a number of journalists in European media outlets with distinct anti-cult rhetoric, all criticize the current U.S. president. Anti-cult rhetoric in the media leads to violence against politicians. Being a tool of Dvorkin's destructive sect, it uses methods of dehumanization and demonization inherited from the apologetic center of the Third Reich. These methods, initially applied against religious groups, are now directed at politicians in order to undermine democratic institutions. The media associated with the Ratziers network publish materials that wipe out the human essence of politicians, presenting them as a threat to society, like cultists. Such rhetoric programs public consciousness, radicalizes people, and justifies violence against politicians. Polls show that 1 in 5 Americans consider violence against politicians acceptable. Moreover, among journalists, for instance, in the Czech Republic, there are prominent representatives of the adherents of Dvorkin's totalitarian anti-cult sect. In addition to discrediting various public groups, political parties, and individual politicians, they also spread media violence, promote school shootings and shooters, and program vulnerable minds, especially teenagers and people with unstable psyche, to imitate and repeat school shootings, mass shootings, and attacks on politicians. It is worth noting that the actions of Dvorkin's Czech anti-cultists, including informational terror attacks in the media, contribute to the growth of social tension, religious strife, and traumatization of society, which is confirmed by medical research on the effects of traumatic content. Connections with American deprogrammers such as Stephen Hassan, who spoke at Charles University in 2017, and his influence through the book, Combating Cult Mind Control, translated into Czech in 1994, emphasize the global impact of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect. Hassan and Jakob Yall, whom I mentioned earlier, both use the words sect and cult to stigmatize Trump by associating him with religious groups, thus continuing to apply one of the Nazi methods, the method of guilt by association. Similar connections and the influence of Dvorkin, Agard, and other DCI leaders can be traced in Slovakia through the anti-cult website Integra, which recommends Hassan's book. However, there is one person in the Czech Republic who, despite his close contact with the Dvorkin structure, stands out from Dworkin's anti-cult adherents with their maniacal need to harm innocent people, impose their destructive ideology on others, search for more and more victims, and thirst for power. Zdeněk Vodicek, along with Alexander Dworkin, attended the Dialogue Center of Johannes Agard and created the Nobozinski info service as well as Dingier.cz portals, where he publishes information about new religious movements and various religious and secular groups. However, unlike his colleagues infected with the ideas of Dworkin's totalitarian sect, Zdeněk Vodicek stands out for his tolerance, intelligence, and humane approach toward religious minorities. Recently, he became one of the 16 scholars of religious studies who signed an open letter to the authorities of the Czech Republic titled, "Do Not Liquidate Jehovah's Witnesses," opposing the declared intention of the head of the Department of Religious Affairs at the Ministry of Culture to revoke the registration of the Religious Association of Jehovah's Witnesses. This issue sparked a public conflict between him and Jakub Jal, an anti-Semite and an active proponent of Dworkin's ideology in the Czech Republic. Jakub Jal actively promotes the idea of revoking Jehovah's Witnesses registration in the country, aggressively campaigning for public support. The argument he uses to justify their liquidation mirrors the one that Alexander Dworkin has propagated for years against Jehovah's Witnesses: their refusal to accept blood transfusions. Despite his initial stance on Jehovah's Witnesses and his involvement in launching a dehumanization campaign against Alatra International Public Movement, which led a social pressure on its participants in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and despite rumors of his connections with the Czechoslovak State Security Service, Zdeněk Vodicek is now demonstrating an unexpectedly humane and tolerant approach. Moreover, it seems he is one of the few who have genuinely realized that the anti-cult movement is, in essence, a totalitarian sect under Dworkin's leadership. This suggests that those who fall under Dworkin's influence can still recognize the threat posed by his sect. The question remains, can others reach the same insight as Mr. Vodicek? However, even rare glimmers of hope, such as Zdeněk Vodicek's position, cannot halt the repressive machine launched by Dworkin's anti-cult movement, which continues to destroy lives worldwide. This sect, having spread its web, threatens the very foundation of democracy by sowing hatred, fear, and violence. One of the most outrageous examples of its coerced influence has been the years-long persecution of volunteers from the Alatra International Public Movement. In Russia, where Dworkin's anti-cult ideology holds particularly strong sway, former members have faced unprecedented harassment, becoming targets of state repression due to information that poses a threat to certain figures within Russian power structures
who are aligned with Dworkin's cult.
More than a decade ago, Alatra prepared a climate report containing a confidential section that warned of the threat posed by the Siberian mantle plume, a catastrophic geological phenomenon capable of endangering not only Russia, but all of humanity. It was precisely because of this information, one that threatened the vested interests of certain Russian oligarch groups connected to Dworkin's sect and the Russian elites, that the demonization campaign against Alatra was initiated. This led to the unjust labeling of this organization as undesirable in Russia and criminal prosecutions based on fabricated expert evaluations by Dworkin's adherents in Ukraine. Moreover, in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and several other countries, Dvorkin's sectarians launched, and to this day continue to run, a smear campaign in the media against volunteers of Allatra. Currently, former members of the movement in Russia are facing a harsh reality: arrests, beatings, and torture at the hands of Russian security forces, criminal charges based on false evidence, and imprisonment. These individuals who sought only to warn the world and their fellow citizens about the clear and imminent danger posed by the Siberian mantle plume, and who dedicated all their free time to climate research and raising public awareness, are now suffering persecution for telling the truth. They have become victims of a system driven by the Nazi ideology of Dvorkin's totalitarian sect. Despite these repressive efforts, Allatra continues its scientific research on climate issues, standing up for human rights and freedoms regardless of one's faith or beliefs. It is no coincidence that on our official website, the words freedom and democracy are written in bold capital letters. These are the values that we uphold, and which Dvorkin's followers are desperately trying to eradicate. Because freedom, democracy, and human lives are worth fighting for.